The void was not empty. It was full of silence. It was a dense, pressing quiet that Kalen had come to know better than the sound of his own heart. He moved through the spinal corridor of the Glycon Data Archive, a ghost in a machine of ghosts. The archive, designated Kronos 7, was a moon-sized sphere of crystalline latticework and humming energy conduits. A library for an empire that believed history was a thing to be written, not lived. Here, the Glycon hegemony stored the sanitized chronicles of 1,000 conquered worlds, each entry a polished lie, each omission a genocide. Kalen's feet made no sound on the glowing deck plates. His suit, a patchwork of salvaged stealth fabrics and scavenged thermal dampers, drank the light and bled only cold. He was not here to destroy the archive. Destruction was loud, and his war was a quiet one. He was here to commit an act of theft, to steal a memory the Glycon had worked so hard to erase. 5 years ago, his home, the terraforming colony of Viridia, had been judged chaotic by the hegemony. It had been cleansed, not with bombs or plasma, which leave rubble and witnesses, but with a gray, shimmering wave of disassembly nanites that had unwritten an entire world, leaving behind a perfectly sterile sphere of rock, scrubbed clean of every blade of grass, every building, every bone. Kalen had only survived because he'd been on a long-haul salvage run in the system's outer belt, watching through a telescope as his world dissolved into a whisper of dust. The hegemony had then excised Viridia from every star chart, every registry, every historical record in the galaxy. It was as if 2 million souls had never existed. But they had forgotten one thing: the raw, unredacted data from their own cleansing fleet had to be archived before it could be sanitized. It would be here, in the deepest, most secure vault of Kronos 7, for less than a standard cycle before being permanently purged. He reached the primary data core, a pulsating orb of light suspended in a magnetic field. The air thrummed with the power of 1 billion stolen stories. Glycon's security was elegant, layered, and utterly predictable. It was designed to repel fleets and armies, not a single man who thought like a scavenger. A man who knew that even the most perfect systems had cracks where the dust settled. He didn't hack the system, he spoke to it. His interface tool, a jury-rigged device he called the Key, didn't use brute force. It introduced a paradox, a tiny, elegant loop of logic that the Archive's administrative AI couldn't solve, forcing it to quarantine the corrupted sector his sector and ignore him entirely. He slid a data wafer into the port, its surface etched with the faint outline of a viridian fern. The download began, a silent torrent of information flooding the tiny chip. As the progress bar crawled across his visor, the memory he was fighting to preserve ambushed him. He was back in the cockpit of his scrapper, the stray dog, the ship he'd had before he built the Silence. He saw the Glycon fleet arrive, not with the roar of warships, but with the chilling calm of an exterminator. Their ships were things of polished obsidian and biomechanical grace. Shaped like predatory insects, they didn't hail. They didn't warn. They simply deployed the cloud. It had rolled over Viridia's northern continent first, a pearlescent fog that shimmered under the twin suns. From his telescope's limited view, it looked almost beautiful. But then, the comms traffic from the surface had turned to screams, then to static, then to nothing. He watched the green and blue of his world fade to a uniform, sterile gray. He had watched for 17 hours as the cloud consumed everything he had ever known, every face he had ever loved, his brother, his sister-in-law, his niece who had just learned to walk, all unwritten. When it was over, the Glycon fleet departed as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind a perfect, silent monument to their philosophy of order. In that moment, Kalen had died, and something else had taken his place. Something forged in absolute silence and fueled by a single, burning purpose, remembrance. A soft chime pulled him back to the humming core of Chrono 7. Download complete. He pulled the wafer, the most precious object in the universe, and slid it into a shielded slot in his suit. He had it. He had the proof. The unfiltered telemetry, the comms chatter from the Glycon ships, the biosignatures of 2 million people blinking out one by one. He had the truth, and now he had to get out. As he turned, a subtle shift in the core's rhythmic pulse told him he was out of time. The AI had resolved the paradox. Alarms, silent and invisible, blared across the Glycon network. On the bridge of the Hegemon's gaze, the fleet's command vessel, Archon Valerius, watched the alert bloom on his tactical display. A data breach. In Chrono 7, it was impossible. His face, a mask of aristocratic severity, tightened. A ghost signature, his sensor officer reported, her voice a reedy chirp. Vessel class, unknown. A composite. It is powering up in the shadow of the archive. Valerius's eyes narrowed. A composite ship suggested a scavenger, a pirate. Unacceptable. Launch the purifiers, he commanded, his voice as cold and sharp as chipped obsidian. I want the vessel, its contents, and the pilot's neural pattern for analysis. No debris, no witnesses. Erase them. The silence peeled away from the archive's hull, a sliver of darkness against a field of stars. Kalen was already strapped into the cockpit, his hands flying across controls that were a chaotic fusion of a dozen different species technologies. The ship wasn't beautiful. It was a utilitarian beast, all sharp angles and mismatched plating, built from the bones of dead ships Kalen had salvaged over 5 years of exile. Its engines ran cold, baffling sensors, and its hull was layered with alloys that bent light and absorbed scans. It was a ship designed to be forgotten. 3 Glycon Purifier-class ships detached from the main fleet, accelerating with terrifying speed. They were smaller than the capital ships, built for pursuit sleek, fast, and armed with phase disruptors that could tear a ship apart on a molecular level. They didn't fire. Not yet. They moved to flank him, their movements perfectly synchronized, a predator's calm efficiency. Kalen didn't run for open space. That was a fool's game. Instead, he dove, plunging toward the turbulent veil, a nearby nebula of corrosive gas and sensor-distorting particulates. The purifiers followed, unconcerned. Their scanners could compensate, but Kalen wasn't trying to hide from their scanners. He was using the nebula as a weapon. His visor displayed the nebula's complex gas densities and gravimetric shears. To the Glycon, it was a hazardous obstacle. To Kalen, it was a roadmap. He cut his main thrusters, letting momentum carry him deep into a thick cloud of ionized hydrogen. The lead purifier adjusted, its pilot confident. Kalen smiled grimly. He ejected a single, small probe, no bigger than his fist. It wasn't a mine. It was a mimic. It broadcasted a specific energy frequency he had copied from Glycon engine schematics, the signature of a critical coolant leak. The lead purifier's automated systems reacted instantly. Believing its target was leaking catastrophic radiation, its own containment protocols flared to life, energy shields rerouting to protect the ship from a non-existent threat. For a crucial 2 seconds, its forward-facing sensors were blinded. In those 2 seconds, Kalen fired a single kinetic slug, not at the ship's hull, but at a fragile or exposed comms antenna. The slug shattered the antenna, and the purifier, now blind and deaf to the fleet's network, flew past him into the nebula's depths. One down. The other 2 realized the deception, their formation breaking as they compensated. They were learning, but they were still predictable. They expected him to either fight or flee. He did neither. He turned the silence and flew directly at the second purifier, a suicidal maneuver. The Glycon pilot, governed by rigid combat doctrine, prepared for a head-on weapons lock. Instead, Kalen's ship fired a magnetic grapple, latching onto the purifier's underbelly. He cut his engines and let the enemy ship tow him, tucking the silence into its sensor blind spot. The third purifier, unable to get a clean shot without hitting its partner, was forced to fall back. Kalen crawled through a maintenance duct in his ship, a bypass cable in his hand. He slapped it onto the grapple line, sending a surge of chaotic data directly into the purifier's hull. He wasn't trying to control it, just to confuse it. He overloaded its internal systems with gibberish fake temperature warnings, false proximity alerts, ghost signatures inside its own hangar bay. The Glycon pilot was inundated with a storm of phantom emergencies. Alarms shrieked on its bridge. Automated fire suppression systems engaged, filling corridors with inert gas. The pilot, overwhelmed, was forced to disengage from the hunt and deal with a dozen critical threats that weren't real. Kalen detached the grapple and kicked his thrusters, leaving the second purifier spinning in confusion. He was clear of the nebula now, but the third hunter was on him. Its pilot clearly an ace, anticipating his moves. Phase disruptor beams sliced past his cockpit, so close he could feel the static charge crackle across the hull. There was no outrunning this one. He had to end it. Diving toward the system's asteroid belt, he targeted a massive, iron-rich rock. He didn't fire a torpedo. He launched his last grapple, embedding it deep in the asteroid's surface. He swung the silence around the asteroid in a tight, brutal arc, using the rock's immense mass as a slingshot. The G-force slammed him into his seat, his vision tunneling. The purifier, unprepared for the violent, gravity-assisted maneuver, tried to follow but couldn't match the turn. It overshot him by a fraction of a second. That was all Kalen needed. As the silence whipped around the asteroid, he fired his main cannon, a salvaged railgun that hit with the force of a falling mountain, directly into the purifier's exposed rear engine assembly. The ship bloomed into a silent, white-hot flower of plasma and shattered metal. He was free, but he wasn't finished. Drifting in the asteroid field, cloaked by the wreckage of his pursuer, Kalen turned his attention back to Chronos 7. He still had a link, a back door into their system from his initial infiltration. It wouldn't last long, but it was long enough. He took the data wafer, the soul of his lost world, and fed it not into his ship's storage, but into its broadcast array. He pushed the entire, unedited file out through the archive's own galactic comms network. He sent the screams, the static, the sight of a world being unmade across every open channel, every military frequency, every civilian network the archive could reach. It was a poison pill of truth delivered into the heart of the Empire's pristine narrative. and to the end of the massive data packet, he appended a single, looping audio file recorded in his own voice, quiet and steady against the backdrop of his ship's humming life support. It wasn't a threat or a declaration of war. It was a promise. "I am Kalen of Viridia," the voice said, echoing across the stars. "And we were here." He then severed the connection, watching as the Glycon fleet, now in chaos, tried and failed to scrub the signal. It was already gone, propagating through 1,000 relays, a ghost that could never be exorcised. In the cockpit of the Silence, Kalen leaned back, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving a profound and hollow ache. He had the memory of his people safe, and he had given that memory to the galaxy. He looked at the star chart, at the vast, uncaring darkness stretching before him. Archon Valerius now knew his name. The entire Glycon hegemony would be hunting him. His quiet war was about to get very, very loud. He set a course for the outer fringe, for the lawless spaces between empires where allies were rare and survival was a commodity. His face was unreadable, a mask of grief and resolve. He had fired the first shot, not with a weapon, but with a story. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that the story was only just beginning. The journey to the outer fringe was a long fall through silent, unclaimed space. Kalen kept the Silence running cold, a ghost ship slipping through the cracks between monitored hyperlanes. He lived on recycled air and nutrient paste, the ship's hum a constant companion. The Viridia data was his sole passenger, a 2 million soul ghost in the machine. He didn't watch it. He didn't need to. He had seen it live. Instead, he monitored the galactic networks, watching the ripples of his broadcast spread. The hegemony was in damage control, flooding the nets with counter-narratives, calling the data a sophisticated fabrication by anarchists from the fringe. But they couldn't erase the signal's origin point, Chrono 7. For the first time in centuries, the hegemony's perfect, sterile narrative had a stain it couldn't scrub away. The word Viridia was being whispered in a dozen languages on 100 worlds, a name resurrected from the void. Some called him the Ghost of Viridia, others the Rememberer. The hegemony simply called him the Anomaly, and the bounty they placed on his head was high enough to buy a small moon. He was heading for Erebus Station, a place that existed in defiance of every Glycon principle. Erebus wasn't built, it had grown. It was a chaotic amalgamation of derelict capital ships, hollowed-out asteroids, and salvaged habitats, all lashed together in the stable orbit of a dead star. It was a city of scavengers, exiles, information brokers, and rebels, a festering wound in the hegemony's orderly galaxy, and the only place Kalen could think to go where a ghost could walk among the living. Docking the Silence at Erebus was like leaving a sterile laboratory and walking into a teeming, chaotic jungle. The station's internal atmosphere was a thick stew of ozone, spice-laden smoke, and the tang of unrefined fuel. Gravity was a suggestion, fluctuating as you moved from a salvaged cruiser's spine to a habitat spun from an asteroid core. There was no central authority, only a fragile ecosystem of syndicates and factions. Kalen moved through the throng, his face hidden by a hood, his senses on high alert. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for an information broker known only as the Weaver, a woman rumored to possess a network that ran deeper and darker than the hegemony's own intelligence core. He found her in a place called the Glitch, a bar housed in the repurposed command bridge of a fallen warship, where flickering holographic advertisements cast shifting shadows on the patrons. The Weaver, a woman named Lyra, was not what he expected. She was young, with eyes that seemed far older, and her fingers, adorned with neural interface rings, danced over a floating console of pure light. "The ghost of Viridia," she said without looking up as he approached, her voice a low murmur. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid to show your face here. The bounty on you is making everyone greedy." Kalen remained standing. "I'm not here to be seen. I'm here to see. I want to know what the galaxy is doing with my message." Lyra finally looked at him, her gaze analytical, unimpressed. "Doing its fracturing. The hegemony's vassal worlds are clamping down, enforcing information blackouts. The free colonies are terrified you've just painted a target on all their backs. And in the shadows, people who lost their worlds the same way you did are starting to hope. Hope is a dangerous, flammable thing. Kalen," she knew his name, "you've given them a story," she continued, "but a story isn't a weapon. It's just a reason to die." "Then help me make it a weapon," he said. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a man who moved with the heavy, grounded certainty of a lifelong soldier. He was broad-shouldered, his face a roadmap of old scars, and he was flanked by two others who carried themselves with the same weary discipline. He stopped at their table, his eyes fixed on Kalen. "Corbin," Lyra said, a note of warning in her tone. "This is private." Corbin ignored her. "You're him," he said to Kalen, his voice like grinding rock. "I saw your broadcast. I was a Legionnaire on Cygnus X1 when the hegemony pacified it. They didn't erase us. They just broke our backs and turned our world into a factory. We fight them in the shadows. Little cuts. A supply ship here. A data spire there. We bleed them. But we don't hurt them." He leaned in, his gaze intense. "That data you stole, that's more than a story. It's proof of their methods. It's a reason for the rest of the galaxy to finally be afraid of them. I want it." Kalen didn't move. "It's not for sale. I'm not asking to buy it." Corbin retorted, "I'm asking to use it. My people have the will to fight. What we lack is a symbol, a flag to rally under. Viridia can be that flag." Lyra scoffed. "He's a ghost. Corbin, not a general. He didn't start a war. He published an obituary." Before Kalen could respond, a sudden chill swept through the glitch. The bar's ambient noise seemed to dim, the patrons shifting uncomfortably. A new bounty had just appeared on the station-wide network, updating in real time on the holographic displays. The previous offer was gone, replaced by a direct commission from the hegemony itself, bypassing all syndicates. The new price was astronomical, and it came with a name, Inquisitor Mar. A collective shudder went through the room. Inquisitors were the hegemony's scalpels. They didn't command fleets. They dismantled threats from the inside out with terrifying precision. They were spies, assassins, and political saboteurs of the highest order. If Mar was here, he wasn't hunting Kalen with ships. He was turning Erebus itself into a weapon against him. "We need to go," Lyra said, her composure finally cracking. "Mar doesn't make arrests. He sanitizes problems." Corbin's hand went to the heavy pistol at his hip. "The station's exits will be watched. His agents will already be in place." Kalen's mind was already working, processing the new reality. He had brought the wolf to the door of this lawless sanctuary. "He'll expect me to run for my ship," he said quietly. "He'll have every docking bay locked down and scanned." He looked at Corbin. "You know the station, the maintenance tunnels, the old service conduits." Corbin nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The underside, a maze. Most of it isn't even on the official schematics. Mars agents will be using the station's own security network against us." Kalen continued, his plan forming in the space between heartbeats. "Lyra, can you get me a direct tap into the station's power grid mainframe?" Lyra's fingers were already flying across her console. "It's a mess of patched-together systems, but yes." "What are you thinking?" "Mar thinks I'm a ghost who hides in the dark," Kalen said, a cold fire in his eyes. "I'm going to turn on all the lights." The plan was audacious. Instead of escaping, they would move toward the station's central power core, while Corbin and his soldiers created a diversion in the upper market levels, drawing Mars agents into a public firefight. Kalen and Lyra would descend into the station's guts. They moved through cramped, humming corridors, the air thick with the smell of hot metal and ozone. Lyra, guided by Kalen's instructions, worked her magic, her interface weaving through layers of ancient, forgotten code. They reached a primary power conduit junction, a cathedral-sized cavern of arcing electricity and humming capacitors. "Okay, Ghost," Lyra said, her face illuminated by the glow of her console. "The system is open. What's the play?" "Every system on the station is fighting for power," Kalen explained, plugging his own key into her feed. "Life support, gravity, security. They're all in a constant state of flux. Mars agents have stabilized a small part of the security grid for their own use, giving them a tactical advantage. I'm going to take it away." He didn't hack the security grid. He hacked everything else, with a few commands. He sent a massive power surge to the station's non-essential systems. Luxuries the syndicates had installed over the years flared to life. The holographic advertisements in the market squares blared at 5 times their normal brightness, blinding anyone looking at them. The gravity plating in entire sectors suddenly fluctuated, sending Mars agents stumbling as their weight shifted unpredictably. Artificial atmospheric controls went haywire, filling corridors with harmless but dense fog. He turned the station's inherent chaos into a weapon, creating a storm of malfunctions and sensory overload that targeted the hegemony agents specifically. As their own comms filled with a cacophony of false alarms, he and Lyra were feeding into the system. In the ensuing chaos, Corbin's team, now fighting on an even playing field, was able to break contact and fall back toward the rendezvous point. As Kalen and Lyra made their way toward the underside docks, a figure stepped from the shadows. He was Glycon, but wore the simple, functional armor of an Inquisitor's acolyte, not a soldier. He held a phase pistol, its aim steady. "The Inquisitor commends your ingenuity," the acolyte said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He has learned from your tactics." Lyra froze. But Kalen had anticipated this. Mar wouldn't rely solely on agents. He would have direct enforcers. Kalen had spent 5 years scavenging derelicts, often in zero gravity. He knew how to use the environment. He slammed his hand on a nearby coolant pipe control, a rusted manual valve. A jet of supercooled nitrogen gas erupted from a crack in the pipe above them, instantly flash freezing the floor between them and the acolyte. The agent, his boots suddenly fused to the deck, hesitated for a second, Kalen didn't. He unslung his railgun not to fire it, but to use its powerful magnetic clamps. He aimed it at the metal ceiling above the acolyte and activated the magnets at full power. The weapon shot out of his hands, flying upward, but the magnetic pull was so strong it tore a heavy sheet of deck plating loose. The plate, weighing half a ton, dropped directly onto the immobilized acolyte, crushing him in a brutal final clang of metal on metal. They reached the underside docks, a cavernous, low-gravity hangar bay where ships were repaired and contraband was loaded. Corbin and his 2 surviving soldiers were waiting, their faces grim. The silence was there, Kalen having remotely summoned it through the underside's unmonitored access tunnels. "Time to leave," Corbin grunted, gesturing them aboard. As they scrambled up the ramp, another figure appeared on the gantry above them, silhouetted against the dim light of the hangar. It was Inquisitor Mar himself. He was tall and unnaturally still, his face an unreadable mask of calm authority. He didn't raise a weapon. He simply watched them. "Kalen of Viridia." Mar's voice echoed through the hangar, amplified but calm. It was a voice that did not know doubt. "You cannot run from order. The chaos you embrace will be your undoing. We will unwrite you, just as we unwrote your world." Kalen paused at the top of the ramp, turning to face the Inquisitor. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply raised his hand, holding the data wafer containing Viridia's last moments. "You can't unwrite something," Kalen said, his voice steady and clear, "if everyone remembers it." He stepped inside, and the ramp of the silence hissed shut. The ship's engines flared, and it lifted off, slipping out of the hangar and into the star-dusted void. Aboard the bridge, the 5 of them stood in silence for a moment. A ghost, a broker, and 3 broken soldiers. An unlikely crew forged in a desperate escape. Lyra brought up a star chart, its holographic light illuminating their determined faces. "He's not going to stop," she said softly. "Mar will hunt us to the edge of the galaxy." "Let him," Corbin growled, checking the charge on his rifle. "We're done hiding." Kalen looked from their faces to the glowing data wafer in his hand. He had wanted to preserve a memory. But Corbin was right. Lyra was right. It was no longer just a memory. It was a map. It was a key. It was a weapon. And his quiet, lonely war of remembrance had just found its first soldiers. The silence jumped to hyperspace, leaving the chaos of Erebus behind, a tiny spark of rebellion carrying the weight of a forgotten world, now aimed directly at the heart of an empire. Aboard the silence, the quiet was no longer a solitary comfort for Kalen. It was a space filled with the breathing of 4 other people. The ship, designed for one, felt crowded with the weight of their shared purpose. In the cramped cockpit, Lyra had integrated her own console, its ethereal light a stark contrast to Kalen's rugged, physical controls. Corbin and his 2 soldiers, Jax and Rihanna, had turned the small cargo bay into a makeshift armory and barracks. There was a new tension in the air, the friction of disparate lives forced together by circumstance. Corbin, a man accustomed to clear orders and direct action, grew restless with Kalen's methodical silence. He saw the Viridia data as a war cry, a tool to incite rebellion across the fractured colonies. "There are other cells like mine, scattered from here to the core," he argued during one of their first strategic meetings, his voice filling the cockpit. "We can use this data to unite them, Form a real fleet, a real army. We can make the hegemony bleed, Lyra countered, her fingers tracing lines of influence on her holographic star chart. An army of scavengers and broken soldiers against the full might of the hegemony. That's not a war. Corbin, it's a slaughter. They'll crush us. The Data's true power isn't in rallying the desperate, it's in convincing the powerful. She pointed to a region of space veiled in political neutrality. The Synedrion, an assembly of the oldest independent worlds. They predate the hegemony. They operate on precedent and galactic law. The Glycon officially abide by their charters, even if they ignore them in practice. The Viridia Data isn't just a tragedy, it's a violation of those very charters. It's proof that the hegemony is a rogue state. Kalen listened, absorbing their perspectives. His war had been one of personal remembrance, a quiet vigil. Now, it was being shaped into something larger, something he wasn't sure he was ready to lead. He looked at the data wafer, which he now kept in a small, shielded case by his pilot's seat. It was the last piece of his home. Handing it over to a council of politicians felt like a betrayal, but using it to send thousands to their deaths felt like a desecration. He saw a third path, a fusion of their two ideas. "We do both," he said, his voice cutting through their debate. The cockpit fell silent. "We go to the Synedrion, but we don't go as beggars. We don't go asking for help." He looked at Corbin. "We go with an army at our back. An army you will help me build." He then turned to Lyra. "And you will pave the way, not with a plea, but with a warning. You will make the Synedrion understand that the hegemony's chaos is coming for them next. We don't give them a choice between action and inaction. We make them choose a side." It was a plan born of a scavenger's pragmatism, use every part of the kill. They would use the data to legitimize their fight in the eyes of the powerful, while simultaneously using it as a banner to unite the broken. Their first destination was the Synedrion's hidden capital, a world known as Axiom, but the journey was long, and the Silence, though formidable, was not a warship. It needed supplies, fuel, and, most importantly, better encryption. Lyra found them a sanctuary Port Requiem, a bustling trade hub in the contested zones, a place where allegiances were as fluid as the markets. "It's neutral," she assured them. But neutral doesn't mean safe. Mars propaganda is already seeping into these systems. We're being painted as anarchist terrorists who destroyed a Glycon archive. As the Silence slipped into a docking berth at Port Requiem, the station's vibrant chaos felt different from Erebus. It was more orderly, a place of commerce, not just survival, but beneath the surface. Kalen felt the same predatory tension. Inquisitor Mars' shadow was long. They split up. Corbin and his team went to acquire military-grade power conduits and munitions on the black market. Lyra, using a forged identity, sought out a cryptographer to upgrade their comm systems. Kalen remained with the ship, monitoring the port's networks, his instincts screaming that they were walking into a trap. He felt Mars' methods now. The Inquisitor wouldn't use brute force here. It would be a violation of the port's neutrality. He would use something more insidious. He would use the truth, twisted into a lie. Kalen's suspicions solidified when he intercepted a fragment of encrypted hegemony traffic, a logistics report for a Glycon patrol, scheduled to respond to a distress call in this sector. But there was no distress call. Not yet. He sent a one-word message to Lyra and Corbin, Mar. They knew what it meant. The trap was here. It was closing. Corbin and his soldiers were making their way back through a crowded market when the explosion happened. It wasn't on the station. It was out in the shipping lanes. A silent flash of light visible through the station's massive viewports, followed moments later by a tremor that ran through the deck. A ship had been destroyed. Then the port-wide alert system came to life. The calm, synthesized voice of the station AI announcing a tragedy. The civilian medical freighter, Saint Jude, en route with supplies for the outer colonies, had been destroyed by an unprovoked attack almost immediately. The port's public data streams were flooded with evidence. A sensor log showing a cloaked vessel matching the Silence's unique energy signature powering up its main weapon. A grainy image of their ship firing. A doctored comms recording of Kalen's voice, taken from his Viridia broadcast, twisted into a cold-blooded claim of responsibility. It was a perfect, calculated act of political assassination. Mar had framed them, not just as killers, but as murderers of the innocent. They were no longer ghosts of a forgotten world. They were monsters. Port Requiem's security forces, an independent militia known for their rigid adherence to the law, sealed the docking bay. An ultimatum was broadcast the vessel's Silence was to surrender its crew for judgment, or it would be destroyed. They're not going to let us talk our way out of this. Ryanus and one of Corbin's soldiers said grimly over their private comms, "We're trapped." "No." Kalen's voice replied from the ship, calm and cold. "He's trapped." Kalen sat in his cockpit, his hands not on the flight controls, but on his key, its interface plugged deep into the station's network. Mar had made one critical mistake. He had used the station's own systems to plant his false evidence, believing his Inquisitor-level encryption was flawless. He had underestimated a scavenger who had spent years learning that every system has a backdoor, a forgotten diagnostic port, a flaw in its original code, while Lyra, now back on the ship, fought a digital war against Mars agents, trying to keep them from completely severing their access. Kalen wasn't trying to erase the fake evidence. He was following it backward. He was hunting for the digital ghost of the man who planted it. Meanwhile, Corbin and his team were pinned down in a cargo depot, besieged by station security. "We need a distraction. Kalen. Now." Corbin barked. "Give them a new target." Kalen replied. He sent Corbin a set of schematics. A few minutes later, a series of small, precise explosions rocked a nearby power substation. The lights in their sector flickered and died, plunging the area into darkness and chaos. The station's security forces, their attention now divided, were forced to redeploy. It was the opening Corbin needed. Under the cover of darkness, he and his team didn't retreat to the ship. They moved deeper into the station, following Kalen's directions. They were heading for the Port Requiem Network Control Center. Back on the Silence, Lyra let out a sharp gasp. "I found it." Mars agents are sloppy when they're arrogant. They routed their final command through a commercial relay to mask its origin, but the relay keeps a buffer, a temporary log. I have the original, undoctored command packet. It includes the targeting data for the St. Jude and a direct authorization from a terminal flagged with a Hegemony Inquisitor's seal. "Send it to me," Kalen ordered. "Corbin, are you in position?" Corbin's voice was breathless. "We're at the door." "It's sealed." "Not for long," Kalen said. He rerouted power from a life support system 2 sectors away, sending a massive surge of electricity into the control center's door lock. The magnetic seal overloaded with a shower of sparks and a loud bang. Corbin's team stormed the room, stunning the two technicians inside. "The system is ours," Corbin reported. What happened next was not an escape, but a counterattack. Kalen didn't just clear their names. He put Inquisitor Mar on trial in front of the entire population of Port Requiem. He seized control of every public screen, every speaker, every private terminal on the station. The first thing he displayed was the pristine, untouched data from Viridia, the silent, shimmering wave of nanites consuming a green world, the screams, the 2 million life signs blinking out for a full minute. The station was held captive by the ghost of his home. Then, Kalen's own voice came over the system. Not the twisted version from Mars fabrication, but the quiet, steady voice of a witness. "My name is Kalen of Viridia," he began. "The Glycon hegemony calls me a terrorist. This is what they did to my world. Now I will show you what they did to yours." He then played Lyra's data, the original command packet. The screens showed the hegemony's targeting solution locking onto the medical freighter. They broadcast the cold, clean authorization to destroy a ship full of civilians, all to frame a single enemy. He showed them the lie, and then he showed them the liar. The final image he broadcast was a security still from the docking bay on Erebus, a clear shot of Inquisitor Mar's face. The silence on the station was absolute, a profound, heavy stillness of shared shock and horror. The ultimatum from station security vanished. A new directive took its place. All hegemony-flagged vessels were to submit to inspection, and all known agents were to be detained. Riots broke out in the markets as independent traders and spacers turned on anyone suspected of being a hegemony sympathizer. They had not just cleared their names, they had ignited a fire. As the silence lifted from its berth, unmolested, Port Requiem's security chief sent them a private, encrypted message. It contained updated star charts, known hegemony patrol routes, and a single sentence, "Give them hell." Drifting in the star-dusted darkness beyond the port, the crew stood on the bridge once more. They had survived, but the victory felt hollow. The ghosts of the saint. Jude now traveled with them, a fresh weight added to their cause. Kalen looked at the faces of his crew, forged in chaos, now bound by something more than survival. They were no longer just running. They were hunting. And, for the first time, Kalen understood that he was no longer just the keeper of a memory. He was the commander of a reckoning. The incident at Port Requiem was a spark in a tinderbox. News of the hegemony's false flag operation, backed by the irrefutable data Lyra had pulled from their own network, spread through the contested zones like a shockwave. Independent systems, long cowed by the hegemony's quiet threats and overwhelming military presence, began to stir. Mars' carefully constructed narrative had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly, painting the hegemony not as an enforcer of order, but as a dishonorable tyrant willing to murder civilians to silence a single voice. Kalen had wanted an army at his back when he faced the Synedrian. Now, it seemed the army was building itself. From the cockpit of the Silence, Lyra monitored a torrent of encrypted communications, small, independent militias, planetary defense forces, and even corporate security fleets from worlds with grievances against the hegemony were reaching out. They weren't swearing allegiance. Not yet. They were offering support fuel, safe harbor, intelligence. They saw in Kalen's small rebellion a chance to push back against the suffocating blanket of Glycon control. Corbin, energized by the shift, began coordinating with these disparate groups, his military experience proving invaluable. He was no longer just a soldier looking for a fight. He was becoming a reluctant diplomat, weaving together a fragile coalition of mistrustful factions, all united by a common enemy. They're calling themselves the Viridian Covenant, he told Kalen one cycle, a note of awe in his voice. They're painting the fern leaf you etched on your data wafer onto the hulls of their ships. You've become a symbol, whether you like it or not. Kalen accepted the news with his usual quiet intensity. The weight of this growing movement pressed on him. He had sought only to make his world remembered, and now he was responsible for the fate of thousands who saw a future in that memory. He spent his time not in celebration, but in study. He and Lyra pored over the stolen Viridia data, not for the horror, but for the methodology. This is more than a record of a genocide, he explained, pointing to the telemetry data from the Glycon cleansing fleet. It's a complete operational profile, their energy signatures, their command protocols, the exact frequency of their disassembly nanites. They believe their technology is so advanced that they don't need to worry about it being reverse engineered. His scavenger instincts had taken over. To him, the hegemony's greatest weapon was just another piece of salvage, waiting to be understood and repurposed. Their destination was still Axiom, the seat of the Synedrian, but their path was now a strategic one. Corbin laid out a course that would take them through the Terminus systems, a region where a number of their new, tentative allies were located. The plan was to meet with their leaders, solidify the alliance, and arrive at Axiom not as a single ship, but as the clear leader of a new, unified political and military bloc. It was a bold move, designed to force the Synedrian's hand. Inquisitor Mar, however, was not a man to be defeated by a single setback. He adapted. Humiliated at Port Requiem, he had retreated into the shadows, and his silence was more terrifying than his threats. The hegemony's official response was to recall their ambassador from the contested zones and issue a galactic notice declaring Kalen's growing covenant a terrorist organization, vowing to eradicate it with all necessary force. It was a declaration of open war. Their first rendezvous was in the orbit of a gas giant named Xylos, a world whose moons were home to a society of grizzled, independent miners. The Miners' Guild had been bled dry for decades by unfair hegemony trade tariffs. As the silence approached, it was met by a squadron of repurposed asteroid cutters. Brutish, rugged ships retrofitted with heavy plasma cannon and kinetic launchers. They were ugly, powerful, and flown by pilots who knew how to fight in 3 dimensions. Their leader, a formidable woman named Lena, met with them aboard the Silence. We're with you. Thorn, she said, her voice raspy from a lifetime of unfiltered air. But our ships are slow. We are built for hitting rocks, not for fleet maneuvers. In a straight-up fight, the hegemony's purifiers will tear us to pieces before we can even get in range. It was a problem Kalen had anticipated. Their coalition was a patchwork of different technologies and combat doctrines. They couldn't fight like a hegemony fleet, all synchronized and precise. They had to fight like what they were, a rebellion. You won't have to, Kalen told her. He projected the Glycon fleet data he had been analyzing. You don't need to match their speed. You just need to know where they're going to be. He had discovered a flaw in their tactical AI. The hegemony fleets, for all their power, were slaves to efficiency. Their battle formations, their pursuit vectors, Their flanking maneuvers, they were all dictated by a logic core that prized optimal energy expenditure above all else. It made them predictable. "We won't engage their fleets head-on," Kalen explained. "We'll set the battlefield. We'll use your knowledge of this system's asteroid fields and gravimetric anomalies to create traps. We'll bleed them, one ship at a time. We fight like scavengers, smart, dirty, and patient." As he spoke, a priority alert flashed on Lyra's console. It was a fleet-wide distress call, broadcasting on an old, rarely used emergency frequency. A small, agricultural colony on the fringe of the Terminus systems, Delphos, was under attack. It was a world of no strategic value, but it had publicly declared its support for the Covenant. The hegemony fleet wasn't glassing the planet. They were landing ground troops. It was a message. This is the price of defiance. "It's a trap," Corbin said immediately. "Mar knows we're here. He's baiting us. He wants to draw our new fleet into an open engagement where he can crush us." "If we don't respond," Lena countered, her jaw tight, "this Covenant dies before it's even born. No one will trust a leader who leaves his allies to die." They were caught. To fight was to fall into Mars' trap. To flee was to shatter the fragile hope that held their alliance together. Kalen looked at the tactical display, at the blinking red icon representing the Delphos system. He saw the cold logic of Mars' move, but he also saw an opportunity. The Inquisitor expected a military response. He expected ships and weapons. He didn't expect a ghost. "We will answer their call," Kalen announced, his voice steady. "Lena, assemble your fleet. Corbin, coordinate with them. You will jump to the Delphos system, but you will not engage. You will hold at the system's edge, in the cover of the Oort cloud. Create as much sensor noise as you can. Look like an invasion fleet preparing to strike." Corbin and Lena looked at him, confused. "What are you going to do?" Corbin asked. "I'm going to give the Inquisitor what he wants." Kalen replied, his eyes fixed on the schematics of his own ship. "A target." While the newly formed Covenant fleet moved into position, a slow, lumbering force designed to look like a threat, Kalen took the silence on a different vector. He flew alone, dark and cold, toward Delphos. Lyra, Jax, and Rihanna remained with Corbin on the fleet's new command ship, a heavily armored miner's hauler. Kalen was going in alone. As he approached the system, he could see the hegemony fleet in orbit, a command cruiser, likely Mars, and a dozen Purifier-class escorts forming a tight blockade on the planet below. Transport ships were ferrying troops to the surface, rounding up colonists. It was a brutal, efficient operation. Kalen didn't try to break the blockade. He skirted the system's edge, his ship a whisper of cold on the solar winds. He was heading for Delphos' small, forgotten moon. It was a barren rock, notable only for a defunct, pre-hegemony communications relay, an ancient piece of technology long since abandoned. He landed the silence in a deep, shadowed crater and got to work. Using his key, he interfaced with the ancient relay. Its systems were archaic, but they were not networked with any modern hegemony technology. It was a ghost system, perfect for his purposes. He spent hours working, not just repairing the relay, but modifying it. He turned the massive broadcast dish into a focused energy weapon, a primitive but powerful microwave emitter, powered directly by his ship's reactor. It was a classic scavenger move, turning junk into a weapon. Then, He used the relay to do what it was originally built for. He broadcast a message, but he didn't send it to his allies. He sent it to the hegemony fleet. He used the access codes he'd deciphered from the Viridia data, spoofing the signal to make it look like it was coming from inside their own command cruiser. The message was a single repeating data packet, a ghost signal of a critical failure in the flagship's reactor containment field. It was the same trick he'd used in the Nebula, but on a massive scale. On the bridge of the Hegemon's Retribution, Inquisitor Mar watched his tactical display with cold satisfaction. The rebel fleet was holding at the edge of the system, just as he predicted. They were cautious. Soon, their conscience would force them to attack, and he would annihilate them. Then, a red alert flared across every console on his bridge. Reactor breach imminent. Containment failure. His engineers frantically reported that their own diagnostics showed nothing, that the core was stable. But the ship's automated systems, trusting the authenticated command code, disagreed. They began to react, shunting power, sealing blast doors, attempting to eject the failing core. Mars' perfect, orderly command bridge dissolved into chaos. He realized, a moment too late, what was happening. It was a digital attack, an echo of the logic bomb that had crippled the archive. It was Kalen, as Mars' fleet was consumed by its own internal phantom crisis. Kalen activated his improvised weapon. The ancient relay dish on the moon swiveled, aiming directly at the command cruiser. A silent, invisible beam of focused microwaves shot across the void. It wasn't powerful enough to pierce the ship's military-grade hull, but it didn't need to. It struck the cruiser's primary sensor and communications array. The delicate instruments, designed to detect the faintest energy signatures across light years, were instantly fried, overloaded by the raw, brute force energy. Mars' flagship was suddenly blind and deaf. In that moment of engineered chaos, the Covenant fleet struck. Emerging from the Ort cloud, Lena's miners and Corbin's rebels didn't engage the purifiers. They made a high-speed burn directly for the hegemony transport ships, the ones ferrying troops to and from the planet's surface. They were soft, unshielded targets. The battle was short and brutal. The transport ships, caught completely by surprise, were destroyed or disabled. With their flagship crippled and their ground operations severed, the remaining purifiers were suddenly vulnerable, their perfect formations broken. They fell back, regrouping around Mars' blinded cruiser, and then, receiving no new orders from their silent commander, they made a calculated retreat. They jumped from the system, leaving Delphos behind. Kalen watched them go from the lonely surface of the moon. He had not destroyed Mars' fleet. He hadn't even engaged it directly. He had simply dismantled its plan, piece by piece, turning its own rigid logic against it. As the Covenant ships moved into orbit around the now liberated colony, their cheers echoing across the comms, Kalen stood alone in the silence of his cockpit. He had saved a world. He had solidified his army. But he knew this was just a single battle in a war that was growing larger and more terrible with every victory. Mar was not a man who would accept defeat. He would learn from this. And he would return, not with a trap, but with a storm. The victory at Delphos cemented the Viridian Covenant as a legitimate force in the galaxy. Worlds that had once offered only quiet support now openly joined the rebellion. Their fleet, which had started as a handful of repurposed mining vessels, swelled with frigates from planetary defense forces and cruisers crewed by hegemony defectors. What had begun as Kalen's personal war of remembrance had evolved into a full-scale galactic insurrection. He was no longer just a symbol. He was the de facto military and political leader of a revolution, a role he neither wanted nor felt equipped for. He spent his time in the ship's engine room, his hands covered in grease, finding a strange comfort in the tangible logic of mechanics, a respite from the impossible calculus of war and politics. Corbin had become his executive officer, a bridge between Kalen's unconventional strategies and the military discipline of their growing fleet. Lyra, now the Covenant's intelligence chief, had woven a web of spies and informants that reached deep into hegemony territory, turning their enemies' secrets into their own weapons. The Synedrian, seeing the tide turn, finally sent an envoy. They formally invited Kalen to Axiom to present his case, to show them the Viridia data and make his argument for their official sanction. It was the political victory they had been fighting for, but it felt like a trap. Mar has been silent for too long. Lyra warned during a council meeting aboard their new flagship, the captured miner's hauler, now christened the Remembrance. He's not a man who accepts public humiliation. He's planning something final. Kalen knew she was right. Mar wasn't just a military commander, he was an inquisitor. His purpose was not just to defeat, but to purify, to erase. He would not allow Kalen, the living embodiment of a historical stain, to stand before the oldest political body in the galaxy. Axiom was where Mar would make his final move. The journey to the Synedrian capital was a tense procession. The Covenant fleet, now over 100 ships strong, moved in a defensive formation, every sensor scanning for the inevitable ambush. Axiom was a world of serene, crystalline cities and meticulously manicured landscapes, the very picture of enlightened order. It was a world that had not known war in 1,000 years. As they entered the system, they were met not by a hegemony fleet, but by Axiom's own formidable security force, which escorted them to a designated orbit. Kalen, along with Lyra, Corbin, and a small honor guard, descended to the planet's surface. The Synedrian's grand chamber was an awe-inspiring space, a hemisphere of flawless crystal under a sky filled with swirling, captured nebulae. The delegates from 100 worlds sat in tears, their faces a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and fear. Kalen stood alone in the center, the silence of this chamber a different kind of quiet from the one he knew. It was the quiet of judgment. He did not give a speech. He did not make a plea. He simply played the data. He projected the last moments of Viridia onto the chamber's crystalline walls, the silent, shimmering cloud, the green world turning to gray, the voices on the comms turning to static, the 2 million life signs winking out. He let the truth of his world's death fill the pristine hall, a ghost at the heart of galactic law. When it was over, a profound, horrified silence settled over the delegates. "This is the Glycon hegemony," Kalen said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of all he had lost. "This is the order they offer. We did not ask for this war. We are simply the first to survive it." Before the delegates could respond, a single, urgent alert chimed through the chamber. The Axiom security chief's face appeared on the main screen, his expression grim. "We have an unscheduled, unauthorized vessel that has just dropped out of hyperspace in high orbit," he announced. "It's not a warship. It's a single, massive object. It is broadcasting on all frequencies. It is calling itself the Finality." A chill went through Kalen. It was Mar. This was his endgame. On the main screen, the image shifted to a live feed from orbit. The object was a colossal Obsidian spire, bristling with strange, non-military antennae. It was not a weapon in the conventional sense. Aboard the Remembrance, the Covenant fleet went to high alert, but the spire didn't power weapons. Instead, a wave of energy, invisible and silent, washed over the planet. In the grand chamber, the lights flickered. The holographic nebulae in the ceiling dissolved into static. And then, a new sound began to echo. A low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. Lyra's eyes widened in horror, her hand flying to her temple as if in pain. "It's not a weapon," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's an amplifier. A psycho-reactive amplifier." Inquisitor Mar's voice suddenly filled the chamber, not through a speaker, but directly inside their minds. A calm, invasive presence. "Delegates of the Synedrion," the voice echoed, serene and terrible. "You have been shown a memory of chaos. Now, you will be shown the necessity of order." The hum intensified. Across the planet of Axiom, a wave of collective, primal fear began to spread. The delegates cried out, clutching their heads. The guards stumbled, their discipline dissolving into panic. Mar was not attacking the planet. He was attacking its mind, using the spire to amplify and project the raw, unfiltered terror of every genocide the hegemony had ever committed, focusing it into a single, overwhelming psychic wave. He was forcing them to experience the very chaos he claimed to prevent. Kalen felt it too, a cold dread that threatened to paralyze him. But he also felt something else, the grief for his world. The memory he had carried for 5 years was a shield. His pain was his own. It could not be drowned out by Mar's manufactured horror. He looked at Lyra, who was struggling against the psychic onslaught. "The spire," he said, his voice cutting through the mental noise. "It's broadcasting a signal. Can you find its frequency?" Lyra, gritting her teeth, nodded, her fingers flying across her personal data slate. "It's complex. It's harmonized with Glycon neural architecture. It's designed to affect their enemies more than their own people." "Then we won't block it," Kalen said, a desperate, brilliant idea forming in his mind. "We'll hijack it." He opened a private comms channel to the Remembrance. "Corbin, I need you to do something for me. I'm sending Lyra a set of coordinates. On my mark, I need every ship in the fleet to focus their main communications array on that spot and broadcast. Not a weapon. A message." He turned to Lyra. "I need you to isolate the core frequency of Mars broadcast and piggyback a new signal onto it. Use all the power the fleet can give you." She looked at him, her eyes wide with understanding. "What are you going to send?" He pulled out the data wafer one last time. It contained not just the telemetry and the screams, but the raw, unedited biosignatures of every single person who had died on Viridia. 2 million unique, individual patterns of life. "He's broadcasting death," Kalen said softly. "We're going to broadcast life." As the Covenant fleet repositioned, turning their powerful comms arrays into a single, massive transmitter, Kalen stood in the center of the chaotic chamber. He closed his eyes, not against the fear, but to focus on the memory of his home. He remembered his niece's laughter, the smell of the fern forests after a rain, the warmth of its twin sons on his face. He held on to the life that had been, a single point of light against Mars' overwhelming darkness. Now, he whispered into the calm. Aboard the Finality, Inquisitor Mar watched his masterpiece unfold. The Covenant fleet was in disarray. The Synedrion was on its knees. He had proven his point. Order, born of absolute control, was the only answer. Then, his own psychic broadcast began to change. A new signals, raw and powerful, tore through his carefully constructed wave of terror. It wasn't a sound or an image, it was a feeling. It was the collective life force of 2 million souls, not screaming in death, but singing in life. The biosignatures Kalen had unleashed, amplified by the Covenant fleet and piggybacked on Mars' own frequency, flooded the network. The signal, harmonized by Lyra to resonate with the Spire's own architecture, created a feedback loop. The psycho-reactive crystals of the Finality, designed to project fear, were now being force-fed an overwhelming torrent of life, memory, and love. The Spire began to shudder, the hum rising in pitch to a piercing shriek. Aboard his bridge, Mars' serene expression finally broke. He was being drowned, not by fear, but by hope. The Finality could not process the paradox. A weapon of death could not broadcast life. With a final, silent flash of internal light, the Obsidian Spire fractured, its psychic energy imploding in a beautiful, harmless aurora that washed over the system. In the grand chamber, the mental scream cut out. A collective gasp of relief went through the hall. They were free. In the sudden, profound silence, all eyes turned to Kalen. The aftermath was swift. The Synedrion, having directly experienced the hegemony's depravity, voted unanimously to condemn them. They sanctioned the Viridian Covenant as a legitimate sovereign power and declared the hegemony a rogue state. Worlds under Glycon rule. Seeing the Empire's ultimate weapon defeated and its political authority shattered, rose up in open, galaxy-wide rebellion. The hegemony, attacked from within and without, began to collapse. Kalen did not stay to see it. He left the politics to Corbin and the new delegates. He took the silence, his quiet, faithful ship, and returned to the coordinates of his home. The planet was still there, a sterile gray sphere, a silent, perfect tomb. He landed on the barren surface, the dust settling around his boots. The data wafer was empty now, its contents given to the galaxy. He had no pictures, no recordings, nothing left of his world but the memory in his own mind. He had started his journey to ensure his home was remembered. He had ended by using that memory to build a new future for a galaxy he barely knew. He was no longer a ghost, no longer just a rememberer. He was a survivor. And as he stood on the silent dust of his unwritten world, under the light of 1,000 distant stars, Kalen of Viridia finally began to heal. His quiet war was over. A new, louder peace was just beginning.